Elena Martinez moved through Cedar Creek Medical's ICU with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done far more than change 4 bags, though no one here knew that. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant fluorescent drone as she pushed the supply cart down the corridor, her rubber-soled shoes making almost no sound against the polished tile. At 6:22 a.m., before the day shift crowded the unit, she was alone with the machines and their vital rhythms. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical breath, the monitors beeped their steady count, the 4 pumps ticked off medication in measured drops. Cedar Creek was a teaching hospital, the kind where residents rotated through every 2 years with textbooks tucked under their arms and the assumption that experience came in semesters. Elena had been here for 14 months, long enough to map every supply closet, every blind spot in the camera coverage, long enough to become invisible. She restocked the chest tube kits methodically, her fingers arranging sterile gauze and anchoring sutures with precision that would have made a surgical technician pause. But Elena wasn't a surgical technician. She wasn't, strictly speaking, supposed to be a nurse at all. The Pentagon didn't typically embed field-grade officers into civilian hospitals as floor staff, but then again, what was happening in the ICU of Cedar Creek Medical wasn't typical either. Her left hand trembled slightly as she gripped the steel instrument tray, a tremor that came and went, a souvenir from Kandahar, from holding an artery with her bare fingers while the medic's hand shook because you didn't shake during combat, you just didn't, but afterward, in the silence, your body remembered. She steadied the tray, let the tremor pass. Pain was information. Fear was data. Both could be filed away and processed later. The antiseptic smell of the ICU had stopped registering 6 months ago. Elena could smell it anyway, that sharp chemical bite mixed with something fainter, something organic, the smell of infections being held back by better chemistry and better training. She moved through the unit like water, present but unremarkable, the kind of nurse doctors looked through rather than at. This was intentional. This was tactical. This was the entire assignment. Dr. Pierce arrived at 7:15 a.m., his polished shoes clicking against tile with the kind of sound a man made when he wanted to be heard entering a room. He was 43, according to the credential board, Yale residency, private practice consulting, a lake house outside Atlanta that required more than a physician's salary to acquire. He didn't see Elena restocking the crash cart. He saw a Latina nurse in blue scrubs with a name tag and nothing else. He saw someone who belonged to a category he'd already sorted and filed. What he didn't see was the 5-point assessment she'd already completed on every patient in the unit, the mental picture she held of medication interactions, the way she could predict a deterioration before the monitors showed numbers that proved it. The Martinez chart, Pierce said to his resident, not looking at Elena but speaking loudly enough for her to hear. I want to review the interventions from last night's admission. Let's see what happens when we prioritize bedside manner over actual protocol. The resident, a nervous kid named Harrison who couldn't have been more than 26, glanced at Elena with apologetic eyes. Elena had already moved to bed 12, checking the patient's lines with hands that never showed what she thought. Documentation was her shield. Every procedure charted. Every variation noted. Every decision supported by the medical literature pinned to her workstation, the kind of meticulous record-keeping that was, in itself, a dangerous weapon if you knew how to read it. Bed 12 held the colonel. She noticed him the moment he'd arrived 3 days ago, routed through ER with a vague diagnosis of infection, pneumonia, something acquired nosocomial, the kind of diagnosis that covered 1,000 questions. But the colonel's eyes were wrong. His pupils were constricted despite his agitation, his blood pressure holding steady despite septic markers that should have tanked him. His fever pattern was too regular, too controlled. The lab work showed trace elements of a substance Elena had learned to recognize during her 3rd deployment, something that mimicked infection, something that looked like biology but tasted like chemistry. The colonel had been poisoned. Someone inside the government had poisoned a Green Beret, which meant someone inside the government wanted him silenced or dead or both, and they'd chosen a slow method because fast methods left evidence. Which meant Elena was exactly where she needed to be. The chest tube insertion was routine, the kind of procedure they practiced on models in nursing school and then performed 100 times with supervision before they were trusted to assist without a doctor's hand hovering. Elena approached bed 12 with her kit, the 24 French tube, the Heimlich valve, the anchoring sutures, and she moved with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory of a different kind of trauma, from field operating tables and traumas that didn't wait for hospitals. She positioned her hands to demonstrate the 4-point anchor, a technique that wasn't in the Cedar Creek Protocol manual, a technique that belonged to forward operating bases and combat medicine where you didn't have the luxury of redoing your work if something came loose. The colonel's eyes focused on her hands. "Kandahar," he whispered, his voice rough from sedation. 2019, you were the medic. Held that artery. 40 minutes. Elena didn't pause. She threaded the suture through the first anchor point, her movement smooth and certain. The fluorescent lights caught the steel needle. Around them, the ICU continued its mechanical symphony, the ventilators wheezed, the monitors beeped, the 4 pumps ticked. Nobody else heard him. Nobody else was paying attention to the quiet nurse and the septic patient in the corner bed. "You're thinking of someone else," Elena said, her voice soft as medication, neutral as saline. She tied the second anchor point. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. This was composure under pressure, the kind that came from knowing that recognition meant danger for both of them. "No," the colonel said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like tears but probably wasn't, probably couldn't be, because men in his position didn't cry about anything. "No, I know your hands. I know that technique. You saved 17 lives that afternoon. The IED hit the convoy, and you held that artery with your bare fingers because the tourniquet was 50 meters away and the medic's hands were shaking and you just didn't shake." Elena secured the third anchor point. The chest tube was nearly secure now. She could feel Dr. Pierce's gaze on her back, the weight of his attention like a physical thing, like the room pressure changing because a predator had noticed movement. She didn't turn around. She completed the 4th anchor point, surgical precision in every motion. "You should rest," Elena said to the colonel. The words were 6 words, delivered in a tone that suggested nothing more than standard patient care. "Pain management is ongoing. Your oxygen levels should improve now." What she meant was, "I'm here. You're safe. Don't say my name again." The colonel closed his eyes, and Elena began the process of securing the tube, of documenting every detail of the procedure in meticulous handwriting, the time, the gauge, the positioning, the patient's response, the medication administered. Each notation was perfect. Each detail was accurate. She was building a record that would be watertight, irrefutable, a paper trail so clean it could be audited by federal investigators. Because that's what was coming. Elena had been documenting far more than patient care for the past 14 months. She'd noticed the discrepancies in the surgical supply orders 3 weeks into her assignment, small gaps, quantities that didn't match usage patterns, invoices from vendors that shouldn't have required repeat orders. She'd noticed that certain expensive items showed up on charts but never appeared in actual use. She'd noticed that Dr. Pierce made calls to someone he never named, calls that lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, calls that happened every Tuesday at 2:11 p.m. without fail. She'd charted all of it. Ghost billing codes. Phantom orders. A careful financial architecture built on the assumption that nobody in nursing would understand accounting. But Elena understood accounting. Elena understood supply chain fraud. Elena understood that a man with a lake house on a physician's salary was a man with additional income, and additional income required explanation, and explanation was evidence. She finished securing the chest tube at 8:03 a.m. 12 minutes. Clean work. The colonel's oxygen saturation was already improving, the numbers climbing on the monitor like hope moving upward. Elena labeled the tube, initialed the dressing, and prepared to move to the next patient. Dr. Pierce stepped into her path. "The documentation on patient in bed 12, he said, his voice the kind of pleasant that came before something sharp. "I noticed you used a 4-point anchor technique that isn't in our protocols." Elena met his eyes. She didn't blink. 4-point anchoring reduces migration risk by 43% according to the Journal of Critical Care, 2018. "I can provide the citation." "That wasn't my question," Pierce said. He smiled, and the smile was the smile of someone who enjoyed the moment right before he was about to win an argument. My question was whether you were authorized to deviate from Cedar Creek's standard protocols. The standard protocols don't specify which anchoring technique to use, Elena said quietly. My documentation is accurate. The patient's outcome is improving. If you'd like to review the evidence, I'm happy to provide it. Pierce held her gaze for 3 seconds. Around them, the ICU performed its normal functions, alarms beeped, nurses moved, the machines kept people breathing. He turned without another word and walked back toward the nursing station, where his resident was waiting with charts and questions and the kind of deference that came from hierarchy. Elena restocked her supplies and moved to the next bed. But her mind had already pivoted. Documentation was her shield, but it was also a weapon. And weapons, once drawn, required understanding of exactly when and where they would be aimed. The morning shift arrived at 7:45 a.m., flooding the ICU with energy and conversation and the sound of shift change briefings. Elena gave her report to the day nurse, medications, vitals, the improved status of the patient in bed 12, the routine nature of the procedures performed. Nothing unusual. Nothing remarkable. Just another morning in the ICU where critically ill patients were kept alive by machines and careful attention and the quiet work of people nobody remembered. By 2:41 p.m., she had documented 17 supply discrepancies. By 5:27 p.m., she had memorized the vendor phone numbers associated with each phantom order. By 8:08 p.m., when she finally left Cedar Creek Medical to drive home through Atlanta traffic that smelled like diesel exhaust and rain, she had already filed a 7-page encrypted report to the Pentagon's secure server, flagging Pierce's activities for federal investigation, noting the discrepancies, providing dates and times and dollar amounts. What she didn't know yet was that 3 other officers, all Green Berets, all poisoned with the same compound, had already died. What she didn't know was that the man responsible for their deaths worked in the same hospital, in administration, someone with access to the pharmaceutical supply chain and a gambling debt that someone in Shanghai was very interested in collecting. What she didn't know was that the colonel in bed 12 wasn't actually infected at all, and that the substance in his bloodstream was on a 48-hour cycle, and that someone had planned his final dose to arrive exactly 3 days before Elena's embedded mission was supposed to end. But the colonel knew. And he would tell her, during the quiet hours of the night shift, when the ICU grew silent and the machines spoke in their steady mechanical language and there was no one listening except for the woman with scarred hands who'd already saved his life once before. The auditorium at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like cleaning solution and the particular mustiness of a room that never saw direct sunlight. Thursday morning grand rounds. 20 residents arranged in tiered seating, their attention divided between laptops and coffee cups until Dr. Pierce walked to the lectern with the kind of measured confidence that came from knowing no one would challenge him. Elena stood at the back near the door, her badge clipped to navy scrubs, her posture exactly what any competent nurse would present, attentive, deferential, present but not prominent. Pierce clicked his remote. Elena's care plan appeared on the projection screen, 3 weeks of her work, every intervention documented with timestamps and clinical rationale. Her hands remained still. Her breathing remained even. This was the before photograph, she understood. The setup for whatever followed. Here we have what happens when nurses overreach their scope, Pierce began, his voice carrying the tone of a professor explaining a cautionary tale. The Martinez method, ladies and gentlemen. Let's review. He highlighted her notes in yellow. Her recommendation for a second culture on the colonel's infection markers. Her request for a different antibiotic class when the initial regimen showed resistance patterns. Her suggestion that the medication reconciliation discrepancy warranted pharmacy review. Each item met with a click, each click met with ripples of laughter from the residents, uncomfortable at first, then more confident, then openly mocking. Perhaps Nurse Martinez believes her online certification makes her qualified to question attending physician orders. Pierce smiled at his own joke. The residents leaned forward. Someone laughed so hard they nearly choked on their coffee. Another resident elbowed the person next to them. The air in the auditorium shifted, not hostile exactly, but consolidating. A pack dynamic establishing itself. Elena took one measured breath. Her right eye produced a single tear, a physical response her body refused to suppress even as her mind remained absolutely still. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Pierce. The movement was economical. No trembling hands. No face burning. No retreat. Just a woman acknowledging her tear and continuing to stand. "I documented every intervention per protocol, doctor," she said quietly, her voice steady as a surgical laser passing through tissue. "Perhaps you'd like to review the outcomes section where mortality decreased by 40%. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind where the air pressure changes. Pierce's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle flex that lasted 2 seconds before he controlled his expression back into professional composure. The residents suddenly became very interested in their laptops. No one laughed. No one elbowed anyone else. "We'll discuss this offline, Nurse Martinez," Pierce said, his tone suggesting the discussion would be unfavorable and final. He clicked to the next case study. Elena remained standing at the back until the presentation ended, then excused herself with a nod to the assembly. But what happened next didn't just silence the room, it triggered something in Pierce that would compound every day forward. That afternoon, Elena restocked supplies at the vending machine on the 3rd floor. The fluorescent light above hummed its constant frequency, bright and bleaching. She was organizing the lower shelves when Pierce appeared with 2 residents, his presence announced not by footsteps but by the particular way the air moved when he occupied space. He moved like someone accustomed to rooms parting themselves for his convenience. "The Martinez method," he said loudly, ensuring the residents heard every word clearly. "Might work better south of the border where they're less particular about credentials. Does it involve asking patients to rate their pain in Spanish?" He laughed as though he'd said something clever. One resident shifted uncomfortably. Another laughed out of social obligation, that hollow sound people make when they're not sure if something is funny but fear standing alone in silence. Elena continued organizing supplies. Her hands remained steady. Each item placed with deliberate care, chips on the left, candy on the right, bottled water in the door rack. The work required attention that kept her eyes down and her expression neutral, not defensive, not angry, just focused on the task itself. This was its own kind of power, she understood. The refusal to react. The absolute control of her own face while someone else raised his voice to fill the void she created. "Security escorts are standard procedure here for those who don't fit our culture," Pierce continued, leaning against the vending machine with the casual dominance of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Just so you're aware. Some facilities require it. We're not quite there yet, but it might be something to discuss with HR." The residents exchanged glances. The implication was clear without being explicit: Elena didn't belong here. Her accent, her background, her way of being, all of it disqualified her from the invisible set of requirements that defined who fit and who didn't. It was the kind of exclusion that left no bruise, that couldn't be quoted in a complaint because the actual words were benign. Security escorts. Cultural fit. Not quite there yet. That evening, Elena reviewed charts at the nurse's station when Pierce appeared with his tablet, his movements precise and deliberate. She felt him before she saw him, that displacement of air that signaled his presence. He stopped at her shoulder. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp that didn't match the antiseptic baseline of the hospital. "I notice you've been requesting unusual access to surgical supply logs, Martinez," he said conversationally, the tone of a colleague making observation rather than accusation. "Trying to learn something above your pay grade." She met his eyes. Held them. Didn't blink. "Learning never stops, Dr. Pierce. I assumed you'd agree." His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile a predator makes when it realizes its prey is more dangerous than it initially appeared, not frightened, not retreating, just standing there with absolute stillness. He made a note on his tablet. Not a quick note. A deliberate one, taking his time, ensuring she saw the action. Then he walked away without another word. What Elena didn't know was that Pierce had recognized the threat she posed before he fully understood its dimensions. Her documentation had begun flagging discrepancies in his surgical supply orders, vendor overstocking on implants that never left the warehouse, duplicate billings for procedures that never occurred, kickbacks that funded a lake house in North Georgia, and a boat dock he'd never have to declare if the paper trail stayed buried. 3 discrepancies so far. Her meticulous logs were a living audit waiting to detonate. What Pierce did know was that Elena's competence made her dangerous in ways his previous targets never were. They'd been easy to dismiss: emotional nurses, unprofessional nurses, nurses without the education to know what they didn't know. But Elena was different. She documented everything. She asked the right questions. She noticed patterns that suggested someone was deliberately altering medication orders and billing records, and her carefully maintained charts were beginning to create a trail he couldn't control or explain away. That night, after his shift ended, Pierce sat in his office with the door locked and his laptop screen casting his face in blue light. He opened a new document and began drafting. Formal complaints. Patient endangerment allegations. Practice violations. Insubordination. Each document meticulously constructed to build a case that would be irrefutable and final. He pulled a hospital bylaw from 1987, emergency interventions requiring attending physician presence, and began crafting a narrative where Elena's competence became her liability, where her careful documentation of protocols became evidence of her contempt for authority, where her unwillingness to fold under public humiliation became proof of her unsuitability for patient care. He worked until midnight. Then he sent the first complaint to the hospital administrator with a carbon copy to the chief medical officer. Then he made a phone call to someone he knew at the state licensing board. Then he closed his laptop and sat in the dark for 7 minutes, breathing slowly, building his certainty that this problem would be solved by Friday. But what happened next in Elena's quiet shift work, what Pierce saw on the hallway camera feed he'd learned to monitor, would change the entire trajectory of both their lives. The colonel in bed 12 had been watching and waiting, and Elena's composure had just told him something he needed to know. His medic was still working the mission, still embedded, still fighting for him even while someone in that hospital was actively trying to poison him dead. The colonel's oxygen saturation began its descent on Monday night at 11:44 p.m. Elena caught it on her evening rounds, the number dropping from 94 to 91 in the span of 4 hours despite the high-flow nasal cannula pushing 6 liters per minute. She reviewed his latest labs with her finger tracing the CBC results, white count climbing to 18,200, lactate rising to 3.8 millimoles per liter, procalcitonin spiking at 8.4. Standard sepsis cascade. Except the colonel had been on broad-spectrum antibiotics for 72 hours. His infection markers should be trending down by now. They were moving in the wrong direction entirely. She pulled his chart from the medication dispensary and studied the notation Dr. Pierce had entered that morning: empiric coverage adequate. Monitor for improvement. The word seemed almost rehearsed, disconnected from the actual clinical trajectory playing out in bed 12. Elena's hands didn't shake as she photographed the entries with her secured Pentagon-issued phone, the one disguised as a standard Samsung that nobody at Cedar Creek Medical knew existed. Her muscle memory from 18 months of embedded intelligence work took over, fingers moving with the precision of someone who documented far worse than medication protocols in far more hostile environments. The images were encrypted and uploaded to her handler within 40 seconds. By the time she returned the chart to the rack, the data was already being analyzed by intelligence analysts in Arlington. The discrepancies Elena noticed weren't accidental oversights. They were architecture. Someone had ordered 17 trauma chest trays for Dr. Pierce's surgical supply account in the past 6 weeks, a volume that didn't match his actual case volume. The billing codes he'd used were 97203 and 97204, evaluation and management codes that typically covered office visits, not surgical consumables. It was the kind of fraud that took time to notice if you weren't specifically looking for it. Elena was specifically looking. She'd been trained to recognize financial networks that funded operations, to trace money as it moved through institutional systems like blood through veins. What she was seeing in Cedar Creek Medical's ledgers looked less like sloppy billing and more like systematic extraction. The pattern matched something she'd seen before: a base commander in Kandahar moving supply money through ghost requisitions, building a slush fund nobody could trace. Monday night shifted into Tuesday morning with the clarity of a briefing room. Elena remained on her assigned overflow floor, pushing medications to stable patients while the colonel's condition deteriorated in the ICU 3 floors below. She knew where he was. She could feel the distance between them like a physical weight. At 2:16 a.m., his oxygen saturation dropped to 87. At 3:41 a.m., the nursing notes indicated respiratory distress. By 5:33 a.m., when the morning shift came on, the colonel's left lung had stopped expanding with each breath. The chest X-ray showed what Elena recognized immediately from the description one of the ICU nurses mentioned in the hallway, the collapsed lung. But the oxygen saturation drop was too rapid. The clinical presentation was too precise. She'd seen this pattern before in combat medical situations, the symptoms of someone whose body was being systematically poisoned, each dose timed to mimic natural disease progression. Elena had spent 6 months learning the colonel's medical history before she ever laid eyes on him. Pentagon files didn't reveal how he'd been exposed to the toxic agent, only that his deterioration pattern matched 3 other operators from his unit who'd died in the past 8 weeks. The hypothesis was that someone inside Cedar Creek Medical was administering doses through his 4-line, controlled, deniable, building toward catastrophic failure. But the colonel's left lung collapsing in textbook fashion suggested either a natural pneumothorax or someone had accelerated the timeline. Either way, the clock was running. Elena could do the math as well as any ICU resident. A collapsed lung meant his heart was being compressed. Compression meant cardiac output was dropping. Dropping cardiac output meant the margin between living and dead was measured in single-digit minutes. The intercom crackled at 6:52 a.m., code blue, ICU. Code blue, ICU. Elena's hands froze on the for she'd been preparing. The specific location wasn't announced, it didn't need to be. She knew. The medication cart clattered against the wall as she left it. Her feet moved toward the stairwell before her conscious mind completed the decision. The overflow floor could wait. Protocols could wait. The Pentagon intelligence mission could wait. What couldn't wait was the man in bed 12 who'd recognized her hands through a medication injection and whispered her call sign like a prayer. The ICU erupted in controlled chaos when she reached it. The colonel's monitor displayed a rhythm that looked like someone had turned the signal into abstract art, wide QRS complexes, elevated ST segments, the electrical signature of a heart being strangled from the outside. Dr. Pierce stood at the bedside barking orders. Push another amp of epi. Start a second 4-line. Get surgery on the phone. 2 residents moved in tandem, their movements the kind of practiced urgency that came from simulation drills. The colonel's lips were the color of slate. His fingers already going cold at the tips. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but even through the plastic tubing Elena could see the left side of his chest wasn't moving. 1 hemithorax. Just the right lung trying to keep his oxygen saturation above the point of brain death. Elena moved to the crash cart without asking permission. She assessed in 3 seconds, her eyes reading the monitor, her ears processing the vital signs, her hands already reaching for the supplies she knew were stored in the second drawer. Tension pneumothorax. Pressure building in his left pleural space. His left lung completely collapsed. The pressure crushing the superior vena cava, restricting blood return to the right side of his heart. Classic presentation. Textbook mechanism. And completely survivable if someone inserted a needle into his chest in the next 90 seconds. He needs immediate needle decompression, she said, her voice level as clinical fact. She didn't ask. She stated it the way the colonel had once stated orders in a tactical operations center in Kandahar, not as a question looking for permission but as information requiring action. Dr. Pierce looked up from the monitor, his expression shifting into something that resembled confusion before crystallizing into anger. We're waiting for surgical consult, Nurse Martinez. Return to your assigned floor. His words came out with the measured condescension of someone who'd rehearsed this exact rejection, who'd been preparing for the moment she'd step out of her place and he'd get to push her back into it. The colonel's oxygen saturation read 64 on the monitor. 64%. A normal oxygen saturation was 95 to 100. 64 meant his tissue was hypoxic. His brain was already starting to die. Elena's hands didn't shake as she pulled a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart. Her voice remained steady as she held it up for Pierce to see. His left lung is collapsed. The pressure is crushing his heart. He has for minutes before irreversible cardiac arrest. Surgical consult is 12 minutes away. She turned to the colonel's chest, already calculating the anatomy, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, needle angled slightly cephalad. The move she'd performed dozens of times on training models, on wounded soldiers in field conditions where no surgical team was coming at all. Pierce stepped directly into her path, his presence suddenly blocking the bedside. His hand grabbed her wrist with the kind of grip that suggested he'd been anticipating this moment and was prepared to make it decisive. This patient is off limits to you. I've documented your inappropriate boundary violations. Security will escort you if necessary. His voice had dropped into something colder, something that carried the weight of formal authority backed by institutional power. He wasn't just blocking her. He was warning her that stepping forward would trigger consequences that went beyond this single moment. Elena felt the trembling then, but it wasn't fear moving through her chest, it was the physical sensation of two parallel missions colliding headlong. 18 months of embedded intelligence work versus the Hippocratic oath she'd taken in two different uniforms. Pentagon protocol dictated she preserve her cover, stay invisible, document the poisoning and let higher channels handle the extraction. But the colonel's oxygen saturation was now 58. His heart rate was climbing toward 160, the monitors beeping, accelerating into something that sounded like panic. His eyes locked on hers for exactly 1 second, and in that second she saw the thing that broke the equation: he was already gone. Not physically, but mentally. He'd already accepted it. He was watching her make the choice he couldn't make for himself. Pierce pulled his phone from his pocket. I'm calling security now. You're done here, Martinez. His thumb moved toward the screen, the gesture carrying the weight of administrative finality. 3 words into the sentence and Elena's 18-month mission was going to end not in classified triumph but in a forced security escort, termination paperwork, and a poisoned colonel left to die on a ventilator while she was already being loaded into an elevator. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum above the chaos. All the beeping, all the ventilator sounds, all the textbook ICU noise seemed to compress into a single moment of complete stillness. Elena looked at Pierce's hand on her wrist. Looked at his thumb hovering over the phone screen. Looked at the 14-gauge needle still gripped in her free hand. And then she looked at the colonel's chest, where pressure was building toward the point of no return. The monitor's alarm was a shriek that cut through the Tuesday morning quiet like artillery fire through a valley. Elena's hands moved before her brain finished processing the vital signs climbing across the screen: oxygen saturation dropping from 94 to 88 to 79, heart rate accelerating past 140, the numbers themselves screaming an emergency that the colonel's body was already writing in blood and pressure. She moved to bed 12. The colonel's left chest was immobile. Completely immobile. His right side rose and fell with each desperate breath, but his left side had become a wall of dead flesh, sealed shut by pressure building behind his ribs like a bomb counting down to detonation. His eyes found hers across the distance of 3 feet and 185 centimeters of rising internal pressure that would collapse his left lung, then compress his heart, then stop him completely if she didn't intervene in the next 60 seconds. Dr. Pierce appeared at the entrance to the room, tablet in hand, already muttering about escalating to administration about her competency. Elena didn't hear him. Pain was data. The colonel's data was screaming tension pneumothorax. The left chest wall was rigid. The trachea would shift next. The pulse would fade after that. Step back, doctor, Elena said. Not a question. Not a request. A statement delivered in the tone of someone who had said it in Kandahar and in Spin Boldak and in 3 other operations Pierce would never know about. Absolutely not. You will not. Pierce started toward her, his voice climbing in pitch, his privilege and institutional authority suddenly feeling like paper armor against someone who had already survived the worst. Elena was already moving to the crash cart. The 14-gauge needle lay in the drawer like a silver instrument of deliverance. She ripped open the colonel's gown. Her fingers found the landmarks, the second rib, the midclavicular line, the space between where she needed to push. The colonel's breath came in short, staccato gasps. His oxygen saturation was 68 now. Critical. Impossible. The numbers told a story of a man whose body was running out of time measured in heartbeats. "You're committing career suicide," Pierce said, the volume rising, his face already transforming into something crimson and furious. "That's an unauthorized invasive procedure without attending physician presence." She didn't flinch. Didn't hesitate. The needle went in smooth and perpendicular, sliding between the ribs with a kind of precision that came from repetition in places where the electricity could fail and the antibiotics might be 3 days away and your patient was the only operator between a village and massacre. The skin gave. The pleural space opened. The hiss of air escaping was immediate and perfect. A small, urgent whisper of pressure finally finding its escape route. The colonel gasped, not in pain, but in relief, in oxygen finally flowing back into chambers that could expand again. His shoulders dropped. His left chest moved for the first time in minutes. His fingers unclenched from the bed rail. The monitor climbed. 72. 81. 90. 96. Sinus rhythm. His color returning like sunrise over Bagram airfield. 90 seconds. That was all it took. 90 seconds from code to stable, from dead to alive, from impossible to breathing. Pierce's tablet clattered to the floor. "You just performed an unauthorized invasive procedure without attending." His words tumbled over themselves, redundant and furious and already calculating the damage, already drafting the narrative that would turn rescue into violation, into overreach, into grounds. Elena straightened, the needle capped and disposed of with the kind of automatic precision that came from 1,000 safety briefings and 1,000 procedures logged in military medical records that didn't exist in any civilian database. The colonel's eyes were clear now. Aware. Grateful in that wordless way that soldiers understood. He was coding, Elena said quietly. Tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Procedure duration 90 seconds. Patient stabilized. Oxygen saturation now 96. You're welcome to review the protocol. Pierce's fingers flew across his tablet, already typing, his face a shade of crimson that suggested blood pressure numbers that would worry any attending physician. This is documented. All of it. You violated the 1987 hospital bylaw regarding emergency interventions requiring attending physician presence. There are witnesses. He gestured toward the hallway where a cluster of residents had frozen, watching, their faces unreadable. Patient endangerment. Practice violations. Gross insubordination. Elena moved to the monitors. Checked the colonel's pupils. Confirmed the equipment. Her hands moved with the absolute confidence of someone who had done this for 12 years and 3 tours and 2 Purple Hearts worth of keeping people breathing when the circumstances said they shouldn't be alive anymore. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The colonel's hand touched her wrist. His fingers were still weak, but his grip carried meaning. Recognition. The squeeze of someone who remembered Kandahar and the artery held under her bare fingers for 40 minutes while a medic's training screamed that time was running out. By Thursday, the formal complaints arrived in her locker. 3 single-spaced pages. Each one a construction of regulatory language, crafted with the precision of someone who understood how institutions protected themselves. Patient endangerment. Practice violations. Insubordination. Unauthorized procedure. Scope of practice violations. Each citation was cited to regulation and date, each regulation pulled from the 1987 hospital bylaw. Pierce had clearly spent the intervening days researching. He'd even included witness statements from residents he'd coached, their signatures neat and their language borrowed directly from the complaint template. He'd built a termination trail that would hold up in any review board. He'd covered himself legally 3 times over. He'd anticipated her defense and constructed counter-arguments she wouldn't be allowed to make. Elena couldn't defend herself without revealing the mission. She couldn't explain that the colonel wasn't sick from infection but from systematic poisoning that Pierce's own billing records had paid for. She couldn't explain that her 18 months of documentation had flagged 3 separate discrepancies in surgical supply orders that led directly back to his lake house renovations and his daughter's Stanford tuition and his wife's new Range Rover. She couldn't explain any of it without burning the entire Pentagon intelligence operation that had placed her here in the first place. So she didn't explain it. She simply left. Security walked her to the exit at 3 p.m. on a Thursday, her badge deactivated, her access revoked. The walk from the 3rd floor ICU to the parking lot took 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She counted every step. The fluorescent lights hummed their artificial song. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and failure. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her daughter was home early that evening. Elena found her at the kitchen table, homework spread across the surface like an accusation. The girl looked up, confused, happy to see her mother in daylight when daylight belonged to hospitals and shifts and the kind of absence that came from protecting people who would never know her name. "Mommy, why are you home early? Did you get fired?" The words hit like a decompression in reverse, all the pressure suddenly crushing inward instead of escaping. Elena pulled a chair next to her daughter's. She reached into her duffel bag, the one she kept packed for rapid deployment, and withdrew the folded flag. The one from her teammate. The one from Spin Boldak. The one that had been carried through for deployments and kept through 2 failed marriages and finally brought home because the mission demanded everything and the mission was over. "I did good work there, baby," Elena whispered. "Important work." "Then why are you sad?" Her daughter, 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, reached out and touched the flag. Elena had no answer that a child could understand. That protecting people meant losing everything. That sometimes the bravest choice looked exactly like failure from the outside. That the quietest person in the room was often the one holding it all together, and sometimes holding it together meant standing alone in the wreckage of your own career while the person you saved went back to his recovery and the person who destroyed you went back to his fraud. The tears came then, the one she'd held back in the hallway, in the parking lot, in the car. Her daughter climbed into her lap, too young to fix anything, too young to understand, old enough to know her mother was breaking and choosing to do nothing but hold her and break anyway. The folded flag stayed in her hands through dinner, cold pasta her daughter wouldn't eat, water glasses Elena filled and refilled without tasting. By 7 o'clock, the rain had started, that thick Georgia rain that hammered the kitchen windows like it had a grudge. Her daughter was asleep now, curled against her mother's leg, finally exhausted from asking why Mommy looked sad, why Mommy came home early, why the nice hospital people told her to leave. Elena sat motionless at the kitchen table, the flag across her palms. Ranger green fabric, crisp enough to cut yourself on, folded into that precise triangle they teach you in basic, one hand corner to opposite corner, then again, until it's small enough to hold in a closed fist but heavy enough to anchor a soul. This one carried for deployments. Kandahar, 2019. Helmand Province, 2020. Logar Province, 2021. And the last one, the one where the medic who'd taught Elena to read blood pressure by touch, who'd joked about the hot MREs and wrote letters home she'd never mail, who died in her arms with a femoral artery severing like someone had pulled a string, this flag had been with her through all of it. She'd kept it in a plastic bag at the bottom of her hospital locker, beneath the spare scrubs and the emergency power bar. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody needed to know. The flag wasn't a violation. It wasn't classified. It was just a piece of fabric that meant everything, and she'd carried it through 18 months of embedded operations, through paperwork and vital signs and surgical supply discrepancies that no one else could see because they weren't looking for what someone would kill to hide. The rain intensified. Thunder rolled across Atlanta like distant ordnance, that sound that never quite stops making your nervous system flinch, even when you're sitting at a kitchen table 1,000 miles from a combat zone. Elena's daughter shifted in her sleep, burrowed deeper into her mother's leg, seeking the warmth that Elena was no longer confident she could provide. At Cedar Creek Medical, Dr. Pierce was documenting his triumph. The first complaint had been typed by 2:11 p.m. on Thursday, while Elena was still clearing her locker under the watchful gaze of a security officer named Matthews who wouldn't make eye contact. Pierce had titled it an authorized medical intervention, patient endangerment, and filled 17 pages with clinical precision, the exact timestamp of the needle decompression, the precise intercostal space Elena had selected, the reckless disregard for protocol, the dangerous assumption of physician-level authority. He'd bolded the key phrases, unauthorized, scope violation, practice endangerment, and structured the complaint as if he were writing a legal brief, each paragraph building on the last like a wall designed to be impenetrable. The second complaint arrived Friday morning. This one was more strategic. Pierce had pulled archival hospital bylaws, specifically the 1987 addendum about emergency interventions conducted outside direct physician supervision, a rule so obscure it hadn't been enforced since the Reagan administration but technically remained on the books. He'd highlighted it in the complaint, circled it twice in red pen, and written a margin note: this intervention clearly violates established protocol regarding physician presence during emergency procedures. The language was clinical, but the intent was vicious. He was creating a paper trail that made Elena's actions look not just unauthorized but historically, systematically wrong. By Saturday, Pierce had filed a third document, insubordination and repeated pattern of scope violation. This one listed every moment Elena had deviated from his direct orders, every time she'd suggested a procedure, every time her documentation had flagged discrepancies, every time her presence in a room had made him feel like someone was watching, which she had been. He'd reframed her careful attention as aggressive monitoring, her professional documentation as creating a hostile work environment for physician staff, her competence as a threat disguised as nursing. Each complaint had been crafted with the precision of someone who'd been burned before, who understood that termination trails had to be ironclad, that a nurse could be difficult to fire without documentation that made her seem not just incompetent but dangerous. Pierce had learned this lesson well. He'd spent 18 months building a network of pharmaceutical vendors and medical supply contracts that funneled money into his personal accounts, $200,000 worth, and he'd learned that you don't survive on the margins by being sloppy. You survive by building walls. So he'd built this one document by document, complaint by complaint, each one designed to make Elena Martinez look not just like a nurse who'd overstepped her authority, but like a fundamental threat to the integrity of Cedar Creek Medical's operations. Security walked her out at exactly 3 p.m. Thursday, as if Pierce had timed it that way, right after shift change, when the hallways were transitioning and nobody would quite see it happen. Matthews was professional about it. He didn't touch her arm or speak with contempt. He simply escorted her to the employee exit, swiped her badge one final time, and said, "Your access has been revoked, Ms. Martinez." Hospital policy requires, and Elena wasn't listening anymore because she could hear the colonel in bed 12, could visualize the monitors she'd set up, could trace the 4 lines she'd positioned, could feel the absence of her responsibility like a missing limb. The badge he took felt heavier than it should have. Now, at 2 a.m. Saturday morning, Elena sat alone at her kitchen table while her daughter slept and the rain continued its assault on the windows, and she understood something that Dr. Pierce would never comprehend: being fired wasn't actually a termination. It was a transition. It was the moment when the cover became irrelevant because the mission had just become personal. She opened her phone, a standard civilian model with a classified Pentagon direct line buried in the contacts under Mom's auto repair, and composed a single message to her handler at JSOC. No salutation. No signature. Just the facts as only she understood them: Colonel's poisoning traced to pharmaceutical supply chain. Pierce facilitated the arrangement for financial consideration. 3 other hospitals currently using compromised medication sourced through same vendor network. I have documentation. Elena. She sent it, then set the phone down, picked up the folded flag again, and held it against her chest the way she'd held it during the funeral service where she'd had to stand in civilian clothes and pretend to be nobody important, just another nurse in the pews, while the flag they'd buried had been a sister flag, a duplicate, while the real one, the one she'd carried through for deployments, stayed with her, hidden. Evidence of a life the world wasn't supposed to know she'd lived. The response came through at 2:14 a.m. One word: confirmed. She didn't cry again. The tears she'd shed at her kitchen table were already spent, the ones her daughter had witnessed, the ones that had made her feel like she was failing at the only mission she'd never trained for, being someone's mom while carrying the weight of classified operations and dead teammates, and the knowledge that the poisoning of one Green Beret colonel connected to a supply chain that threatened field operators across 3 continents. Instead, she did what she'd been trained to do. She documented. She organized her evidence. She began the process of moving the investigation outside Cedar Creek Medical, outside hospital administration, into the spaces where people like her actually had authority to act. She'd lost her badge, her access, her position. But she hadn't lost the mission. The colonel was still in that hospital bed. The poisoning was still active. And Dr. Pierce was still very much unaware that the quiet nurse he'd successfully terminated had actually been the only thing standing between his fraud scheme and discovery. By Monday, that would change. By Tuesday, it would accelerate. By Wednesday, the entire structure he'd built would begin to collapse, starting with a simple phone call from an Army veteran named Rodriguez who worked in Cedar Creek Medical's IT department and had been watching Pierce's server activity patterns for weeks, noticing the systematic deletions, the attempt to cover tracks, the panic that was just starting to show in his digital fingerprints. But tonight, Elena Martinez sat at her kitchen table with a folded flag and a phone that connected her to the Pentagon, and she began to finish what she'd started, not as a nurse, not anymore, but as something Pierce could never have comprehended, an officer, a field operative, a captain who had absolutely nothing left to lose and therefore everything to win. She didn't move from that table until dawn broke over Atlanta, orange and gray and promising nothing but action. Her daughter would wake soon. They would have breakfast together. Elena would smile in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes, and her daughter would ask if Mommy was still sad, and Elena would say, "Not anymore, sweetheart. Not anymore." She would say that because the mission, the real mission, had just begun. If you're watching this and you've ever been underestimated by someone in authority, someone who thought they could silence you with a complaint or a policy or an access badge, if you've ever had to walk away from something you loved while knowing the real work was just beginning, let me know in the comments what you would have done in Elena's position. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Because Monday morning, everything changes, and you won't want to miss what happens when a Pentagon intelligence officer decides that being fired was the best thing that could have happened to her mission.